When we stopped yesterday, or on Wednesday, we stopped with Zeno and his paradoxes. So we're still in archaic philosophers, and we only had two more sections to talk about. One of those is Hippocrates. So he's considered a famous archaic philosopher. He's actually the first person to take medicine into a science and turn it from this kind of practitioner that focused on magic into somebody who focused on some symptoms and possible outcomes for that. So it takes it into some from a magic superstition into science, if you will. So any of you who are interested in pre-med or my nursing majors, I think you could write your essay over Hippocrates and just talk about how important he was. An arguable thesis might be that he's the most important of the archaic philosophers because he gives us science and medicine that we have today. So what he would do is he would record symptoms of people so that he could compare that with other symptoms and from those symptoms predict a future outcome. So the notion of medical care and treatment comes from him. He's also interesting because, like the Egyptians in the other part of the world, he was one of the first people to say, if you exercised and ate well, you would probably live longer and be more healthy. So in that aspect, he was way ahead of his time. And I don't know if people listen to him even today, but how much easier life would be if we did. So I've gone through all of the individual archaic philosophers. The last one I wanted to talk about is kind of a group, if you will. So later we're going to talk about classical philosophers, and one of those is Socrates, who's perhaps one of the most famous of all the classical philosophers. He was considered to be a sophist in some respects. So sophistry is early rhetoric. So those of you that are interested in debate and argumentation, he would definitely be an important character, or all the sophists were, because they were the debaters of Athens. So let's say you were charged with a crime. You don't necessarily hire a lawyer. You would hire a sophist who would teach you how to argue. And they would look at both sides and then find the truth from that examination. So you could argue that our legal system is based on sophistry, because if you think about it, you have an adversarial system where you have the prosecution and the defense, and both present these arguments. Both use rhetoric, both use persuasion to find the truth somewhere in the middle. And sophistry encouraged that, the notion of, let's see if we can find the truth. So it's kind of considered archaic because we have this notion of Pythagoras and using logic and math, and then Parmenides, who used that logic in rhetoric, is also applied to philosophy as well. So the large group of philosophers were the sophists, and they turned away from nature so much. So one thing they did differently than the archaic philosophers, they didn't really care what the arche was, because they said the focus was on people and society. So you look at where we're living, not how we got here so much. So they would teach grammar, rhetoric, poetry, things like that. So it's kind of useless to focus on how we got here, but you can improve who you are through knowledge, they argued. So they applied that knowledge to community, if you will. So they really focused on political excellence. Protagoras is a really good example of that. So I'm giving you some of these examples because I know your next rough draft is due on the 19th of April. So we want to get kind of cracking and thinking about that. So if you wanted to talk about rhetoric or law or any of those aspects, I think the sophists or Protagoras would be an interesting approach to that. They were very nationalistic about Greece. So they thought Greece was amazing, but they did not believe in a universal truth. So no laws are universal, they argued. And I think this is an excellent point for an essay topic. And we talked about this last semester in class quite a bit, if you took 1153 with me. Is there universal truth? Well, for us as Christians, absolutely. There are absolutely universal truths. They would argue, however, unfortunately, we live in a relativistic world. So the sophists would argue maybe there really isn't a universal truth. So obviously that's a disagreement from our standpoint, but I think you can find some truth in the society in which we live. For example, is murder wrong? The answer should be resounding, yes, murder is wrong. But our legal system is relativistic. Is murder wrong? Absolutely, we could say it is wrong to intentionally take another person's life. But again, there are conditions that would make that relatively right. What if it's self-defense? What if it's in war? Our legal system would argue that those are not crimes, that it's not murder. So you could argue that the sophists were right, that we do live in a relativistic society, that laws are not universal, and they're based from society to society, which there's some truth to that too. I mean, there's a tribe in Zimbabwe that kills every third female child because they have too many females in the tribe. Our culture looks at that and says that's wrong. They would not see why we would think that. So in terms of a Christian aspect, of course, there's this, the perfect world of the absolute. There's God's absolute, and we live in a fallen state. So we're going to have this disturbed and fragmented image of that perfection. I just think it's an interesting notion for paper topic. And I know I say that every class period, probably 50 times, but I'm hoping that at one of them you'll grasp onto and say, okay, that's interesting. I like that. I can talk about that. Now we're talking about the archaic world in ancient Greece, and all of this leads to a pretty interesting historical event that's probably my most favorite event to talk about in terms of Greek history, and it's the Persian War. Why it's my most favorite event is just because there's so many interesting characters involved, and there's just this great story. So I'm probably going to start this story, and I will accompany a quiz to go with this video, and then we'll pick it back up on Monday, because it's funny. Not funny. It's kind of cool, if you will. So the Persian War is obviously based on one huge power structure, which is Persia. So a little bit of a history behind that. We're talking about 6th century BC. We're right before the classical period. So we've got the Iron Age, we had the Heroic Era, the Age of Colonization, Archaic, and now we're getting into the beginning of the Classical Era. The Classical Era, though, it kind of hinges on this war, because if it hadn't been for this war, Athens might not have got the confidence. They might not have done some of the things they did that dove them into the Classical Era, if you will. So after Cleisthenes, we talked about him before, develops this notion of ostracism. Greek starts being ruled by this fantastic statesman called Pericles. He's a definite test question. Pericles, by many people, have said that he's the most brilliant statesman of all the Greek leaders. He promotes art and drama and architecture. He makes Athens become this amazing city-state that everybody knows is the peak of philosophy and culture, if you will. So Athens emerges as this philosophical and artistic center, and in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, we have Sparta. Now, Sparta is, if you've seen the movie 300, there's so much not right about that movie, but there are some things that they had correct, and one of those was the fact that this was a warfare society. So the entire society was focused around warfare and protecting themselves. So some of the basic facts I think are interesting about Sparta is, number one, if you're a woman and you give birth to a Spartan male, then you're considered to be respected in society because you're giving birth to Spartan warriors. And if you're a male, you will be a Spartan warrior. Sparta is known for their warfare. That is who you go to if you want to fight a war. Their military training begins at the age of 7. So at 7 years old, you start your military training, and you become active duty, every Spartan male, at the age of 18. Women owned land in Sparta, not so in Athens. In Athens, the men owned the land, but in Sparta, the women did. Quite frankly, because so many times the men would go off to war and die, so the women had to own the land so that they could maintain their family line. So women there was a respect. They had a place in society, if you will. Some argue they practiced eugenics. So there's a few different stories about this, about how they practiced eugenics. Number one, if you were weak, you had no place in Spartan culture. So some stories have them, if you were a weak baby, they would literally put you outside and see if you survived it. You were fit to be a Spartan soldier. If not, you died of exposure because you were not a perfect warrior. You had no business being alive. But that eugenics is also applied to later on. They had a culture or a ritual at the age of, when you're entering manhood, you would take literally a loincloth and a knife, and you would be left out in the countryside to survive for a long period of time. If you did, you were fit to be a Spartan soldier. If you did not, then it was the way it should be. You may have heard the story of the little Spartan boy and his tunic, if you will. So there's this old children's story about a little Spartan boy who went to his little school one day, and he found a wolf cub, and he put the wolf cub inside of his tunic so that he could hide it from his teachers and that nobody would find it and he could keep the wolf cub. But unfortunately, the wolf cub is a wild animal and was starving, and so during the day, the wolf cub began to chew on this poor boy. But he was such a stoic soldier, and so declared war against pain, if you will, that he refused to let anybody know that this wolf was hurting him until literally fell over dead. There's your Spartan bedtime story, if you will. I actually heard that story growing up as a child, and of course I thought it was a little barbaric and strange. But it does exemplify, Sparta was known for warfare. Athens was known for art and philosophy. So just keep that in mind as we begin the story of the Persian War, which will probably begin on Monday. So I'm just kind of setting the stage for you, if you will. Now, how do I know about the Persian War? Because there's this writer named Herodotus who wrote the Persian War. And in the Persian War, he gives us a very detailed account of the battles, and the dialogue between huge characters, significant characters in history. So he's often called the father of history, bolded, because that's a great test or quiz question. Because he wanted to record history, not epics. So whereas Homer gave us epics, and we have Sappho gave us lyric poetry, Herodotus didn't want to write about that. He wanted to write about history, so he's considered kind of the father of history. Now, he was objective to the extent that if you read the Persian Wars, he praised both Persia and Athens. He didn't have one side or the other. But there still was some objectivity involved, and he focused a lot on mythology and the hubris of both of those. So we know this story from Herodotus, and he kind of sets the story for us, that we know that Persia, who's this huge empire of the time, Persia was very powerful, controlled Egypt, most of the Aegean Sea. They were very cultured and had technological advances that Athens didn't have. They paved roads, the first postal system. In our biblical stories, they're always the good guys. They freed the Hebrews, so they are a huge power. They're a force to be reckoned with. In this story, though, the Greeks will refer to them as the invading force, as the bad guys, because they invade a small city-state called Ionia. And when they do that, this sparks the entire Persian War, if you will. So that's where we're going to stop for now. So right now what I'm going to do is send this video, these slides to you, with the quiz from Wednesday and the quiz to accompany these slides. If you'll email that and get that back to me before Monday in class, we can pick up the very next slide and we miss no time at all. Thank you so much, guys. You're always so very patient and good to me.